This episode is brought to you by Steamy Chick Vaginal Steam Facilitator Certification. Learn the ancient practice of vaginal steaming to improve menstrual cycle health and fertility. Become a vaginal steam facilitator for only $194 online and begin offering this service that is quickly growing in demand as women receive this advanced form of women's health. Head over to steamychick.com and click certification for more information. You are cordially invited. Yes, you. You're invited to join us in my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program, starting in July of 2018. Learn how to chart your cycles, gain confidence using fertility awareness as your primary method of birth control, optimize your cycles for achieving pregnancy, and really learn how to utilize your menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool. For more information, head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. Can't wait to see you there. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 204. Welcome to the 204th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm really excited to share today's episode with you because in today's episode, we're going to be talking about charting apps and fertility awareness. And so recently I was actually interviewed for CNBC, and the woman who contacted me was doing a piece on using charting apps as birth control. And so she was reaching out to get different perspectives. So she mentioned that she interviewed some OBGYNs, she interviewed some women who actively use charting apps as birth control. And so she wanted a fertility awareness educator perspective to kind of weigh in on that. And so it really got me thinking after, she's asking me all these questions about apps and how they can be useful and effective for women, what some of the positives are, what some of the downsides are. And it really got me thinking that just about how apps are used. And ultimately, I haven't really weighed in on it yet on the podcast. So I thought, you know what, let me go on the podcast. Let me do an episode about apps and really share some of the benefits and challenges, especially when you're using the method for birth control. But it still applies when you're using the app for conception for a lot of different reasons. So we'll get into some of those reasons in today's episode. And before we jump into today's episode, I just wanted to take a moment and thank our new show sponsor, Steamy Chick. And so you'll remember from episode 202, which aired really recently, in my interview with Kelly, we talked all about vaginal steaming and how not only is it a powerful healing tool for women for all kinds of menstrual related complaints, it's also used in dozens of countries around the world by women. So even though it's not something that most of us have heard, living in Western countries, I was speaking to a woman the other day whose family is from Haiti, and she mentioned that it's just what they do. So it's really common culturally for Haitian women to do vaginal steaming postpartum. And I thought that was really interesting because I'm West Indian and I had no idea that was just like a regular common practice that women do in Haiti. So make sure to head over to steamychick.com and click on the certification tab for more information about the Steamy Chick Vaginal Steam Facilitator certification. So not only is vaginal steaming important for women's health and something that, you should take some time to learn a little bit more about, I know that there's many of you listening who are practitioners yourselves and may want to consider adding this to your practice or just learning more about it for your own purposes. So again, that's steamychick.com and click on the certification tab for more information about the Steamy Chick Vaginal Steam Facilitator certification program. I was wondering, do you have any plans in July? I wanted to officially invite you to join the 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program. We're starting a new group in July and we're doing something different this time. We're doing a combined group for both birth control and conception-minded women because I found that I always end up with a mix in the group anyways. Whenever I have a conception group, there's women in the group who are actively avoiding pregnancy at the time with a plan to conceive shortly in the future. And when I do a birth control group, there are always women in the group who plan to start trying to conceive within the next 6 months to a year. So I thought, let's just bring us all together. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information and to apply. We'll be starting in just a couple weeks from now, and I'm only doing one group, so there are limited spaces available. So again, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to apply. Now let's jump into today's episode. All right, so let's get into it. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the top 10 issues that can arise when you're using charting apps that predict your fertile window. And so I decided I wanted to do an episode on this topic after being interviewed recently for an article. It really got me thinking because it was like, okay, using apps as birth control. And it's an interesting thing for me to think of using an app for birth control, because I always thought of the app as a place to put my data, not as birth control itself. In a sense, that's what we'll be talking about today. The concept of using apps as birth control and also the concept of relying on an app to predict your fertile window. So I'm going to go through the 10 issues that I have and that can potentially arise with using said apps. So the first issue that I have is that these apps are often they call themselves fertility awareness apps, but they're actually using the rhythm method. And so as a fertility awareness educator, one of the big challenges that I face, and so I know many of you listening are also in the same field, fertility awareness educators as well. So one of the issues that we have is that we're always trying to differentiate ourselves from the rhythm method. And I've done a number of interviews on other podcasts and different, radio shows and things like that. And, inevitably, one of the questions that I get almost every time is, can you tell us the difference between the fertility awareness method and the rhythm method? And so I think it's really important. I think this is a really important place to start because many of these apps, they call themselves fertility awareness, but it's actually not fertility awareness. So, first things first, the fertility awareness method, I would say the golden rule of fertility awareness is that you actually can't predict ovulation. Ovulation is the single part of your menstrual cycle that is the most variable. And so fertility awareness allows you to predict your period because your luteal phase is fairly stable. So it allows you to predict when your period is coming after you've identified and confirmed ovulation, but it does not allow you to predict ovulation. So if you think about charting apps that are actually predicting your ovulation and telling you when you're in your fertile window, that's exactly the opposite of what fertility awareness is all about. And so ultimately, that is the fundamental issue that I have with a lot of charting apps that are actually predicting your fertile window. So the rhythm method, on the other hand, is all about, using past cycles to calculate when your next ovulation is going to happen. That's exactly the basis of the rhythm method. So the rhythm method was a method of birth control that was developed in the early 1900s, and basically that was it. It was based on the idea that a woman's cycle is always stable and it's always about the same amount of days every cycle. And once you get a few cycles under your belt, you can just take an average of the past however many cycles and then project when the fertile window is going to be based on that. And in the case where a woman is basically like a machine and her body just has the same cycle over and over and over again, that can actually be effective in that situation. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. So in many ways, the fertility awareness method is rooted in actual real life, with a clear understanding that a woman's cycles can vary with all kinds of different challenges, whether it's stress or travel or an actual endocrine disorder or, coming off the pill or something like that. Cycle variation is just part of using this method. So for me personally, if this is the first episode of the podcast that you're listening to, if you're not familiar with me and my history with the method, I've used fertility awareness for the past 17 years. So I discovered fertility awareness when I was about 18 and I'm now 35. And throughout that entire 17-year period, I was using fertility awareness for birth control for the vast majority of it. So I do have two children. I have a 5.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. And I used the method for birth control except for a 6-month window combined where I was trying to conceive. So For my eldest son, it took me about 5 months to conceive. And for my youngest son, we conceived the very first cycle that we tried. So collectively 6 months of trying, and outside of that, that's 16 and a half. Minus the pregnancies, but you get the point. So for me, what's really important about fertility awareness, and the reason that I decided that this was going to be my primary method of birth control at the tender age of 18, was because of the efficacy. So fertility awareness has been tested scientifically. So there are studies that have been done where women are taught to chart their cycles, a specific type of charting method, by trained instructors, and followed for a period of time to determine how effective fertility awareness is at preventing pregnancy. And so one study in particular that I'm thinking of, the efficacy rate was 99.4%. And that was why I wanted to use it, because it's very effective. And so after 17 years of using fertility awareness as my primary method of birth control, I know it works. It's worked for me. I've never had an IPSI. I've never had a pregnancy scare or anything like that. And one of the reasons that I wanted to use it was because I really wanted to feel like I was in control, and I really wanted the high efficacy, but I did not want the hormones. So I really wanted to make sure that I had a high efficacy rate so that I could be in control and really only have babies when I wanted to have babies, but not have to deal with the side effects of hormonal birth control. So I think it's really important, going back to the first issue with charting apps, to really be clear on the difference between the rhythm method and fertility awareness. So fertility awareness involves monitoring your signs of fertility on a day-to-day basis and determining basically each day whether or not you're fertile based on what you see. And so with that in mind, your fertility, it has nothing to do with what happened last month or the month before or the previous 6 months, because ultimately the only thing that matters is whether or not you are observing fertile signs today. And that's a huge difference between fertility awareness and method and the rhythm method. The fertility awareness method, and that's why the fertility awareness method is actually an effective method of birth control, because it's a completely different scenario. Fertility awareness is based on the observation. So you're observing your cervical mucus patterns, you're taking your basal body temperature, you may be observing your cervical position. And when you have cervical mucus, it means you're in your fertile window, and those are the days when you can get pregnant. And when you no longer have mucus and you've confirmed ovulation with your different fertile signs, then you know that, you're no longer in your fertile window. So with fertility awareness, what it is you're developing a habit of regular observation so that you can always know when you're in your fertile window, but not know because you've always ovulated on a certain day. You actually know because you checked today. And that's the big difference. So as a fertility awareness educator, and, I've worked with hundreds of women to chart their cycles, I would say one of the biggest challenges for my clients to overcome is that idea. It's that whole concept, that whole rhythm method concept. One of the hardest things to overcome is that you don't just chart like a couple of months and learn when you're going to ovulate and then always know forever. You actually have to diligently check your fertile signs on an ongoing basis. And in order to, if you're using the method, let's say, to avoid pregnancy, then you really have to actually check for mucus every day. And you really have to write it down every day. And you really have to take your temperature every day. And you really have to, so it's something that's ongoing. And it's a completely different concept than the whole idea of using your past cycles and averaging them out to guess when you're going to ovulate this month. So that's the first issue in a nutshell, is that the apps are calling themselves fertility awareness, but really they're not. The moment that you start saying that you can predict ovulation is the moment that you're actually using a version of the rhythm method. And the rhythm method is not an effective method of birth control, and it's certainly not as effective as fertility awareness. And so those things are very different. And so one of the things that I often find myself saying to clients is that it can take quite a bit of time to overcome the years of false information and myths and things that we've been taught about our cycle. And so I find that the concept that you can use an app and it can learn you, so it can learn your cycles, and that it's going to tell you, it's almost this idea that it's going to know you better than you, which is a problem. But also this idea that all it needs is like 6 cycles and then it'll know what's going to happen. That is that is a fundamental teaching of the rhythm method. So that is the way that our culture still looks at the menstrual cycle. It still looks at the menstrual cycle as, 28 days, ovulation on day 14, and always the same. And so if you actually were to look at the data, so if you were to get together 100 women and look at who charted their cycles and look at their cycles over a 12-month period. So you have 100 women chart their cycles for a year. I feel like that is what would need to take for somebody to really get what I'm saying, because that's what I see. I see thousands of charts. I work with hundreds of women. I've worked with hundreds of women. And so I've seen that. I've worked with some of my clients. I work with over 10-week period in my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. Some of my clients I've worked with over a 4-month period in my 4-month coaching program, or even a 6-month period or 12-month period. I've had some clients who've stayed in my alumni groups and, continue to work with them in various capacities. And so and then I'll just throw in there that I've seen my own charts over the past 17 years, and I can tell you that I don't think I've ever had a 28-day cycle. I can say that. And I can also say that, there's never been a time where I just have the same cycle over and over and over again. So the actual data is really different to our understanding and our idea of the menstrual cycle. And so this is my kind of issue with the whole rhythm method thinking, rhythm method idea, because even having an app that tells you like every new cycle, it predicts when you're going to ovulate, it reinforces that idea that you're supposed to always ovulate on a certain day. And it makes you think that if your cycle looks different to that there's something wrong with you. And so that's a big issue for me. So I think I'll just have to leave that there. But number one is the whole concept that the app is passing itself off as fertility awareness, when really it's just reinforcing the idea of the rhythm method, which is that, you just have to learn your cycles, and then your cycles will always be the same. And then you'll be able to use that as birth control, because that's not the same as fertility awareness. So let's move on to number 2. So the second issue that I have with charting apps that predict your fertile window is that they often confuse women and cause them to question their own observations. So I've seen this a number of times. This has come up a lot in my Fertility Friday Facebook group. And actually just the other day, I had a woman post. She posted 2 different pictures in the group. One picture was her, or 2 different pictures. So she'd put the same cycle. She'd been charting in 2 different apps. So this is really common. A lot of my clients will experiment with different things. So maybe they'll get a different thermometer and kind of take temperatures with both to see which one is more accurate, or they'll just do little experiments. So it's really, really common for me to see this kind of stuff. So this particular woman had her cycles in 2 different apps, and both apps gave her a different ovulation date. And so of course she's confused and like, which one should I choose? And so my response was basically, turn off the predictor settings and decide your own ovulation date. And so this is what I mean. So especially for women, I think for women who have more recently discovered fertility, whereas have not really got a full handle on the method itself, and are using the apps and actually kind of trusting more in what they say, I feel like it just makes it more confusing, because you have your own body. Like, so the app is telling you were supposed to ovulate already. The other app is telling you haven't ovulated yet. You've got mucus today, and you don't really know what to trust, when ultimately it would be a lot less confusing if you took a little bit of time to just understand the method itself and really learn to trust what you're seeing in your body. So to really pay attention to your own fertility signs first, and then anything the app says second. So that's a big issue, because and this even women who are not using charting apps. So this is an issue with what I would call rhythm method thinking, which is that, again, this idea that your cycles are just going to be the same over and over again. And if you've charted for like 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, and you've seen that your cycles are typically around a certain length, you kind of assume that they're always going to be around a certain length. And what can happen is, even if your body is physically showing you something different, you're inclined not to believe it because it doesn't fit in the pattern. I've seen this happen a lot. So I'll give you a couple examples. So one example is, let's say that you've been charting your cycles for a while and they've always been around a certain length. But this particular cycle, you're seeing mucus like way earlier. So let's say you've never ovulated before day 16, but in this cycle, you're seeing mucus and it's like day 7. And so what I've seen is clients who are inclined to ignore their mucus because I've never ovulated before day 16. And then they have the sex on the, day 7, or they don't have this. So if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, maybe they'll have the sex on day 7 and see the mucus and think, oh no, I never ovulate that early, and then they get pregnant. Or on the flip side, they're trying to get pregnant and they see the mucus on day 7, but I never ovulate before day 16, and then they don't have sex, and then they end up missing their fertile window. So it would seem like this could only be a problem for women who are trying to avoid pregnancy, but it's a problem for both, and I've seen that happen. So another example would be a late ovulation. So, I usually ovulate around day 15, for example, and it's day 16 and there's no signs of a confirmed ovulation. So I've seen this for women who are trying to conceive, where they'll actually stop having sex because it's past when they usually ovulate, even though their signs don't indicate that ovulation has happened. And lo and behold, 5 days later, the temperature shift finally happens and you can see the mucus pattern changing to indicate that ovulation did happen later. But again, missing out on that window because it doesn't match the pattern. So this is, and it can play out in other ways, but I just want to give you some tangible examples of what I've seen and how this can negatively affect women who are both avoiding or trying to achieve. And you wouldn't think that you could mess up your chances of conceiving, but you can. You actually can, especially with this rhythm method kind of idea, this idea of the pattern. So yeah, that's an issue that I have with the apps that predict the fertile window, because I feel like they do confuse women and they cause women to question their own observations. And it's interesting to me that you could actually have cervical mucus right today, you can actually have it today and question it and ignore it because it doesn't fall within the pattern. So it makes it harder, I would say, for fertility awareness educators out there who are trying to encourage women to not think of their bodies in that very rhythm method way, and trying to encourage them kind of welcome to fertility awareness. Fertility awareness is different to what you've been taught. It's not the same thing. And really what we're doing is getting into the habit of observing so that every day we can decide our fertility based on what we see that day. And it has nothing to do with what we had in the previous cycles. Okay, so number 3, my issue with apps that predict the fertile window is that they do have a higher failure rate than perfect use fertility awareness. The fertility awareness method, I mentioned, one of the studies that has been done specifically and found that the effectiveness rate for the symptothermal method, so combination of cervical mucus, cervical position, and basal body temperature, is symptothermal. So, the efficacy up to 99.4%. If you're using an app that is using past cycles to predict your future cycles, the rate of failure is going to be higher because it is not fertility awareness. So as soon as you get into this concept that we can predict cycles based on the past, it's a different thing entirely from fertility awareness, because, regardless of how good the algorithm is and how wonderful the science is, the app does not know whether you have cervical mucus or not today. And that's just the bottom line. So as a woman who's been charting for so long, like I mentioned, 17 years with only a short window of time when I was actually trying to conceive, that's a risk I wouldn't be willing to take personally. So I would have a really hard time recommending it to anybody because I wouldn't feel comfortable relying on something like that because, like I said, the app doesn't know when I have mucus. So the most reliable sign is me. The most reliable sign is my body. So, so that's an issue that I have with it, that these apps with, rhythm method predictor calculations, if a woman is actually using that as a birth control method, she is going to have a higher failure rate potentially than actually using the method in earnest. So the fourth one is really important. The fourth issue that I have is that regardless of the app, it cannot help you if you have menstrual cycle irregularities. So specifically, an example of that would be polycystic ovary syndrome, like PCOS. So women with PCOS is characterized by long irregular cycles. And so if one cycle a woman has like say 27 days and then the following cycle she's got like 48 days and then obviously there's an issue going on that she needs to address. But with that aside, an app cannot help her because an app cannot predict her fertile window because it's not predictable. And that's the whole point of fertility awareness. It's to acknowledge it's not always that kind of wildly different from cycle to cycle. If it is, then that's an indication of an underlying issue. But it's a really good example to illustrate that if your cycle could vary from 27 days to like 45, the app can't predict when you're fertile, but you can know if you're fertile or not that day based on your observations. So even if you've got wildly different cycles, if you know and understand how fertility awareness works, and you know that it's based on observations, and so you know that each day you're going to check for cervical mucus, you're going to check your basal body temperature, you may check your cervical position. And based on all of the information that you gather, that then you determine if you're fertile or not that day based on what you saw that day. So if you are really clear on that, then it doesn't really matter from a fertility awareness standpoint what's happening in your cycle, because all that matters is what you see that particular day. So other examples, so PCOS, one example, hypothalamic amenorrhea. So women who lose their periods due to overexercise, undereating, or stress, they can lose their periods for months at a time or years at a time. And I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but ultimately an app can't tell you when your period's going to come back. However, if she knows how to chart her cycles, again, she can pay attention. And when she starts to observe cervical mucus, that's a sign that she's approaching ovulation and that's a fertile day. Stress is a good example as well. So, it's not always as kind of big fluctuations as what we'd see in PCOS or hypothalamic amenorrhea, but stress is a good example. Stress affects women's cycles. I see it time and time again. Every time I run a group program, every time I work with a client one-on-one, we always see at least one example of stress in the cycle during our time together. And so that can be something as simple as delayed ovulation. So I always joke that, whenever we see a discrepancy in the cycle, I'll say, well, did you travel? Were you, if you were in the air at any point in your menstrual cycle, you'll probably see some sort of change or shift or something like that. So, one of the things I've seen a lot with travel is delayed ovulation. So for instance, if you normally ovulate around a certain time, potentially travel could push that back. And that's not necessarily something that your charting app is going to account for because it doesn't fall within the average. If all of a sudden one cycle, your ovulation is like a week later, that's not necessarily something that the app could possibly account for. So I think that it's really important just to recognize these situations because, again, when you understand fertility awareness, you recognize that one of the fundamental truths of fertility awareness is based on the acknowledgement, the recognition that your cycles will shift, will change. Fertility awareness is kind of based on like a real world scenario, which says that your cycles will change. There will be variability. If you look at what the scientific research has to say about the menstrual cycle, the pre-ovulatory phase, so before you ovulate in your cycle, is statistically the most variable phase of the cycle, whereas the luteal phase, so after ovulation, between ovulation and your period, that is the most stable phase. And so we have the evidence to prove that a woman's cycle does vary. We can expect variation. So I think it's really important to recognize that an app with predictor settings cannot take into account all of those kind of random things or events that could happen that could shift your cycle. Now, it's not always as dramatic as like a week or 2 weeks delay, but sometimes it is. And every single woman like on earth is going to have at least one or two wonky cycles. And frankly, if you are actively using fertility awareness for birth control, like it only takes one wonky cycle with incorrect instruction to get like it only takes one. So I think it's really important. If efficacy is important to you and that is why you're using the fertility awareness method, I think it's really important to consider just how you're going to use the apps and how much kind of trust and weight you're going to put into them. Because in order to achieve the high efficacy, ultimately that's what this is about. So if for women who are, for whatever reason, they don't want to use hormonal birth control, perhaps they had a bad reaction to it, perhaps they just don't like being on hormones, they don't like how they felt, or maybe they just don't want to be on it anymore, or whether maybe you're in a situation where you don't want to get pregnant right now, but you're thinking about starting to try within the next year or two. So whatever the reason is, if you're looking for an effective method of birth control, my biggest concern with using apps with predictor settings is that from what I've seen personally and professionally, when the one thing you can count on is variation in the cycle. And so these apps can't account for the kind of random stuff that does throw off the cycle, but you can account for that. So you can actually, effectively pay attention to your fertile signs. And so when you have these discrepancies, you can still use the method and gain the 99.4% efficacy. Like if your ovulation is delayed, you would just pay attention to your fertile signs. So if you have mucus earlier than you usually do, well, you're going to ask yourself, like, am I fertile or not today based on what I saw? If you saw mucus, yes, you are fertile. Even if you've never had it early, it doesn't matter because you're seeing it today, and that makes today a fertile day. And so I mentioned PCOS, hypothalamic amenorrhea, HA, and stress. So two other examples just to put out there are postpartum. So again, an app cannot tell you when you're going to ovulate again. No one can tell you that. So in postpartum, for example, if you're breastfeeding, you could get your period back, 2 months later, 3 months later, 5 months later, 8 months later. And so again, that's a scenario where the app does not help you, but you can still use fertility awareness effectively. But again, it's you that has to just do the observational routine. So you actually have to continue to check for mucus. Temperature doesn't really help you until you actually ovulate again, but you got to check your mucus and check for mucus, I should say. And then again, at the end of every day, it's like, what did I see today? Did I see any mucus? Am I fertile or not based on what I saw? And so you can use it, but fertility awareness is a completely different thing. But these apps can't do anything for you in the postpartum period until after your cycles return. And post birth control. So if you've recently come off of hormonal contraceptives are associated with a temporary delay in the return of normal fertility. And the first several cycles off of hormonal birth control are typically outside of the normal range. So whether you've got delayed ovulation and so they're a bit longer, whether you've got a shorter luteal phase or whatever the case may be, or whether it takes them several months to level out. Those are, an example of different situations where your cycles are not kind of following the normal protocols and patterns, and therefore apps can't effectively address these types of issues. All right, so number 5, another issue that I have with charting apps with predictor settings is that most of the apps that are available that do have themselves programmed with these predictive settings, most of them have not been tested scientifically for efficacy. So there are a few devices nowadays that are that have been tested and do have research behind them. If you're thinking about using one of those apps, I would highly encourage you to contact the company directly and request to see some of those studies and request to look at them yourself. I think it's really important to look at those data points and interpret them yourself, obviously. But yeah, I think that's really helpful. Like if you download a period tracker app or something and it's like telling you when you're fertile, I would wager that most of the regular kind of run-of-the-mill apps have never been tested scientifically for their efficacy. And so really, we don't even know how they're using the calculation. we don't know enough about it. So for me, again, I trust what I'm seeing in my body, that real-time measure, much sooner than I would ever consider trusting kind of a random app that's been programmed to calculate an average based on my past cycles. So number 6, even if they have been tested scientifically, I think it's really important to recognize that it's still the rhythm method. So again, the fundamental difference between the rhythm method and fertility awareness is that fertility awareness, in fertility awareness, we acknowledge that ovulation is variable and we cannot predict it. Whereas the rhythm method says, we just need a certain number of cycles, and then we'll be able to predict ovulation, because ovulation is always going to be the same. And so yeah, I would say that it's important just to recognize that. Like, I think it's really important just to recognize that even if it calls itself fertility awareness, and even if it has scientific research behind it, as long as it is predicting your fertile window based on past information, it is still using a different philosophy. So the philosophy doesn't necessarily align with the fertility awareness method. So number 7, so this I kind of touched on in number 6, but with the apps, we don't really know how the algorithm was programmed or how they calculated or what they're doing. So I think that's an issue that I have, because you don't really know how they're making these calculations, and most of these companies don't necessarily tell you. So you have no way of knowing really how they decided to calculate this or why, and what they're using and what prompted them to choose that method over another. Like, you just don't know. So it really calls into question how some of these companies could say that use my app and let it predict your fertile window, when really we just don't know how that information was collected or programmed or anything like that. So number 8, another issue that I have with charting apps that predict the fertile window is that they can, from what I've seen, they can prevent women from developing full confidence in using the fertility awareness method, and kind of be a bit of a barrier between really trusting their bodies and really kind of delving in and understanding it. This isn't true for all women, but I think that because for some women, the charting apps with the predictor settings, that is actually what encourages them to start charting. That is what introduces them to it. So this isn't to say that, all women are going to fall into this category, but I think it's important to mention that, because again, what I've seen is that when the app is different to what you think should be happening, it kind of causes you to question it and lose some of your confidence in what you're seeing. And it reinforces this idea, the rhythm method, that your cycle is supposed to be a certain way. And when it's not, you can kind of feel less than, or, my cycle should be like this, but it's not. And that's one of the things that I work with my clients really closely on, is that idea that, I saw mucus today, but I'm not supposed to see it. Or, my temperature's supposed to rise today, but it didn't rise. Or I didn't want to take my temperature this morning because I didn't get a good night's sleep. So, this idea that the cycle is supposed to be perfect and that it's supposed to fit into a certain pattern. And if it doesn't, then there's something wrong with you or something like that. And my response to those types of things is that, well, if you slept in a little bit or you drank a little bit of alcohol the night before, whatever the case, I always say, still take your temperature and then just write a note. This is real life. I mean, your chart is a reflection of what's happening in your life. Your menstrual cycle is a vital sign, meaning that it always reflects back to you what's happening in your life. And if you're stressed, you may see that your cycle shifts. If you start an exercise routine that's a little too intense, you might start spotting before your period comes, or something equally telling that there was a bit too much stress this month or something like that. So I would say that's an issue with this type of charting. It can prevent you from developing confidence and fertility awareness and really kind of trusting your body, and just it can kind of hinder you from getting into the habit of observing your body and writing it down, and not thinking that you're supposed to have this perfect chart all the time. So number 9, one of the issues I have is that the fertile window for many of these apps, depending on the app, The fertile window, if you're actually using an app or device for birth control specifically that is designed and programmed to tell you when you can have sex and when you can't, many of these apps have to over predict and overestimate your fertile window in order for them to be accurate. I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. The fertility awareness method works because a buffer period is put around the fertile days. So, for example, if you have your period and then it takes a couple of days before you start to see cervical mucus, and then you see mucus, you ovulate, you confirm ovulation, your mucus dries up, your temperature goes up and stays up. So you've confirmed that you've ovulated. The fertility awareness method still gives you an additional 3-day window after your cervical mucus dries up, just to ensure that ovulation really did happen, that the egg is gone and that your mucus has dried up. So it just gives you an extra buffer to ensure effectiveness of the method. And so in the same way, if you're using an app that's going to predict your fertile window and prevent you from getting pregnant if you're not trying to get pregnant, then it does have to give a buffer. And so if your past cycles have been a little bit all over the place, then that's going to have to be taken into account. So many of these apps or devices may actually overestimate your fertile window just to keep you safe if you're trying to avoid pregnancy. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you're wanting to avoid pregnancy and that's going to help to make that happen, then yes. But if you're charting your cycles and you're tracking your mucus, you may end up having several more days of your cycle that you can actually have unprotected sex on and not get pregnant. And so for many women, that's one of the biggest challenges with fertility awareness, is that there is a period of time where you can't have unprotected sex, and for a lot of women, that's a big problem. So the shorter the fertile window is, sometimes the better, because then at least you can have more options, more days where you can actually have unprotected sex with your partner. So that can be a problem. And the last issue that I'll share with you today that I have with charting apps that predict your fertile window is that women who use the apps and keep the predictor settings on, they report discrepancies all the time. So in my Facebook group, I see it a lot. This has been a topic that has come up in conversation quite a bit. And as I mentioned, a woman put up her 2 charts side by side, and both apps had estimated her ovulation differently. So, and then many women who use apps will say that they keep the predictor settings on just for information, and their ovulation often doesn't match up with what the app has told them should happen. So I'll see the comments like that all the time. So those are my biggest issues with charting apps that predict your fertile window. There's things to consider if you're thinking about doing it. And I think it's more of not whether or not you're thinking of using the app, but it's more of a question of how, are you thinking of using the app? And so if women who chart their cycles with these apps who also use fertility awareness, if they're finding discrepancies, if the date they're being told they ovulated on isn't the same as what day they actually did ovulate on, that's just more information for you. It just means that it doesn't mean not to use apps. It just means how are you going to use them, and ultimately, what are some of the best practices for using them? So I'm just going to recap my 10 issues that I went through with charting apps that predict the fertile window. And then I'll go on to share some tips for how to use charting apps, and also tips for choosing one to use. So, okay, the first issue that I had was that these apps that predict the fertile window are actually using the rhythm method and not fertility awareness. And I think it's really important to be clear on that. And we need to kind of just call it what it is. So any device or app that actually calculates your fertile window based on your previous cycles, that's literally the rhythm method and not fertility awareness. So it's really important to know what you're using, what it is and what it's not. Okay, number 2, these apps often confuse women and cause them to question their own observations because they are often spitting out data that is different to what the women are actually physically seeing in their bodies. Number 3, using apps specifically as birth control will have a higher failure rate than using fertility awareness in earnest, especially if you've been trained by someone who knows a particular method you won't get the same efficacy, the 99.4%. It's just not a real thing, because again, using calculations to determine a fertile window is very different than the fertility awareness method. So it would then have a different failure rate than fertility awareness. Okay, number 4, it can't help you if you have menstrual cycle irregularities such as PCOS, hypothalamic amenorrhea, if you are postpartum, if you just had a baby, or if you've just come off birth control, or in just times of stress. So there's a lot of situations where apps with predictor settings, even the ones that have been scientifically tested and have all, more information and science behind them, there are certain situations where they still can't help you. Number 5, most of the apps on the market have not been tested scientifically for their efficacy. So their claims may have absolutely no backing, and most of the time do not, because the majority of the kind of period tracker type apps have not been tested scientifically. And number 6, even if the app has been tested scientifically, it's still a version of the rhythm method in most cases. So I think it's just really important to make that distinction between the rhythm method and the fertility awareness method. So my issue is always the prediction. If you're predicting when I'm ovulating, that is rhythmy and not fertility awareness, not the same thing. Number 7, we don't know how the algorithms are programmed, so we just don't know what their math is like. Number 8, it can prevent women from developing confidence in fertility awareness and trusting their bodies. So it can kind of encourage them to trust more in the app than what they're actually seeing with their own 2 eyes. Number 9, the fertile window often has to be overestimated in order to ensure effectiveness. So you end up with more days that are off the table that you can't have unprotected sex on. And number 10, women who use apps and chart their cycles. So the women who are actually using the apps and are also using fertility awareness find that there's discrepancies all the time between their guesstimated ovulation and their actual ovulation. What do you do now? I'm sure it comes across as I'm like totally anti-app, but I'm not. I just think that there's certain concerns and I have certain issues that I feel like just need to be addressed. So there's no issues with apps. Apps, from my perspective, I think the highest and best use of an app is as a data entry, a place to put your information, and should not be a place to interpret. It should not interpret your information for you. And from my perspective, I don't think it should be telling you when you're fertile, because I don't think there's enough scientific evidence to say that women can use apps to be like their primary birth control method. I think that the best way to use it is to actually understand the method and use the app in conjunction with it, not to only use the app and have no idea what's happening in your body and your cycle. So my number 1 tip for using charting apps, number 1, learn fertility awareness. Learn the method first. Give yourself an opportunity to learn the method before you start relying on the app. I think it's really important to be educated, because through empowerment comes through education. So I think start there, understand it first, and then start kind of looking into what would be the best app, or use app while you learn. But either way, I think the most important thing is for you to actually learn how to use the fertility awareness method. Number 2, decide how you wish to use it. So are you just going to use it as a place to enter your data? Are you just going to track your periods? Are you actually going to chart your cervical mucus and position and basal body temperature? Are you going to try to find an app that you can specifically use as birth control? Like, do you want it to tell you when you're fertile? So I think deciding how you want to use it is really important, because that determines what type of app and what features you need to be looking for. Even just the difference between like a period tracker app and an app that allows you to track your mucus and stuff like that. So knowing what you want to use it for is really important. So number 3, in my opinion, I think that it's important to use charting apps for data entry only, not as a form of birth control. So I'm sure that there are individuals who are listening to this episode that disagree with that, but that's the way I see it. I think that charting apps are really a tool. The apps should be a tool that we can use for our benefit. So, but I think first and foremost, you should know how your cycle works and have that clear understanding of it. And then if then you can use any app you want and put your data in, because ultimately you're the one that's interpreting your data. So I would say, yeah, use the app for data entry, but not as an actual form of birth control. The birth control method is the birth control. The app is the place to enter the information. So number 4, on the flip side, if you are using an app for birth control, then make sure, if that's what you're looking for, if you're actually looking for an app that can track your cycle and can tell you when you're fertile, then I would say make sure to look for a device or an app that has some sort of scientific backing behind it. So make sure to look for an app that does have scientific research that has been studied with real women and has been, you can see how effective it has been. Contact the company, ask for some information, ask them to share the study. If they're boasting that they have had scientific studies done and this is a method of birth control, their device or their app, then ask for it. Email the company and say, hi, thank you so much for your information. I really want to see the research myself. Can you send me a copy of the study so I can read it myself? So, but yes, if you actually want to use an app for birth control, then make sure to get something that has actual scientific backing behind it. Number 5, your fertile signs always come first. It doesn't matter what the app says. What matters is what's happening in your body. So I would say always remember that your body and your observations come first, and anything that you see in the app comes second. Know that the number one thing that every woman will experience throughout her reproductive years is menstrual cycle variation. Don't be surprised if you have one random cycle that you ovulate earlier or one random cycle that you ovulate later. All of these things are normal. So it's really important to recognize that variation is possible and you will experience it at some point. And it's also really important that you go on your bodily signs and not based solely on what the app has to say. Number 6, I would say maintain a healthy skepticism of apps and devices that do advertise as birth control, like where the actual birth control is the app itself. So I would just have a healthy skepticism of that. If you're truly wanting to gain that full efficacy, you really want to, avoid pregnancy, and you don't want to be on hormonal birth control, then I think it's really important, regardless of which app you choose, for you to educate yourself about how to use the method effectively and correctly. It's really helpful to have a backup. I mean, just for basic stuff, like what if it runs out of batteries? Or maybe that's a silly thing to say, but I think that it's really important just to have that backup, to have that knowledge and information yourself, because ultimately there will be a time in your life when the app isn't going to be effective, whether that's during your premenopausal years, when statistically you're more likely to have cycles that are different in length. Some women have shorter cycles. Some women then go on to have longer cycles as they approach menopause. If you plan to have children at some point, if you're in the postpartum phase, or whatever the case may be, there's going to be times when the app will not work for you. And so it's really important to have that basis of knowledge. And the last thing I would say, and this goes hand in hand with the previous points, number 7, really use the app hand in hand with your knowledge. So even if you want to use the app and you enjoy having the predictor settings, make sure that the app is hand in hand with your own understanding. So use the app in conjunction with your knowledge. So tips for choosing an app. So I think we'll end with this today, but I'm not going to be providing any specific brand names and labels and things like that. I would say that we'll start a conversation in the Fertility Friday Facebook group, and we can go in there and have a great conversation about which apps, brands are your favorites and why, and which apps you recommend and which apps you've used, which ones you like the most. But I won't be going through that here. But I will be giving you tips for choosing an app. Because ultimately, apps will come and go. There's been so many new apps out since when I first started charting, there were no apps. It wasn't even a thing. Back in the year, 2000, there were no charting apps. And, fast forward to now, and there's hundreds of them. So when you're trying to choose an app, I would say that the number one thing that you should look for is an app that allows you to turn off the predictor settings. So if you're charting your cycles with Fertility Awareness, you need to be able to understand what you're seeing. And when an app is telling you one thing and you're seeing another, it can be confusing and overwhelming. So having an app that allows you to turn that stuff off so that you can and also an app that doesn't, tell you when you're ovulating, count and all kinds of stuff for you. An app that solely allows you to enter your data without giving you any additional information, nothing. I think that's the best option. So when I used apps for several years, I'm back to paper now. I gave it a go and now I'm done. But I did use apps for several years. And I remember when it was like 7 years ago, I think. And I was looking for an app. And I remember I downloaded a couple and on my phone. And I realized, wow, I couldn't take off the predictor setting. Oh, I can't take off the predictor setting. And that drove me nuts. So I ended up downloading Kandara. And that was what I used for a little while. And the reason I downloaded it was because it was designed for fertility awareness and it allowed you to turn off the predictor setting completely. So I was able just to use it as a place to enter data, and that's it. That's all I used it for. But now, back to paper. I gave it a good go, but paper, I'm a paper girl at heart. So that's been working for me. But either way, I would say make sure that you can turn off the prediction so you can just interpret your data yourself. At least you have the option. Make sure that you at least have the option of it. Even if you like to have it on there, I would say having the option is really important. Okay, number 2, choose an app that allows you to record all of your data points. So you want an app that allows you to record your basal body temperature, your cervical mucus, and your cervical position. So if you're using Fertility Awareness, you just want the option to be able to identify the main 3 fertile signs. If it is not giving you the option to record the main 3 signs, then it can't be a fertility awareness based app. So, and then there may be other information that you want. So some apps will allow you to enter endless categories of anything you want. Did I eat breakfast today, or did I exercise today, or did I meditate today, or whatever the case is. So choose an app that allows you to also add in any other information that you want to track. I would say number 3, look for apps that do not change or manipulate your entries. So from my suggestion is to use apps as a place for data entry, not as a place for data interpretation. So look for apps that just, you just enter the information and it stays the same, not for apps that change your information or somehow adjust it, because to me, that's a slippery slope. I don't want the app adjusting it because I want to be in control. I want to be the one to interpret my own data. And number 4, consider that many of these free apps and many of these period tracker apps and things like that, consider that they do sell your data to third parties for money. So I don't know that they have any identifying information or anything, but if you're putting in information into your apps, many of these companies are actually recording that information and then selling it to other companies for whatever reason. So I think it's important to just consider that when you're choosing an app, if this is a concern for you. So for some women listening, it may not be a big deal, and for others, it may actually be a concern. So if that is a concern for you, then you may want to do a little bit of research about the app that you're looking at and kind of find out how they make their money, if it's free. Because if the app is free, they probably make their money from selling your data to people, because that's just how it works. So just to do the quick recap, so the top tips for using fertility charting apps: learn FAM first. So give yourself an opportunity to learn fertility awareness. Number 2, decide how you want to use the app, and then get an app that is the best fit for what you want to do. Number 3, use charting apps for data entry only, and not as specifically a form of birth control. Number 4, if you are wanting to use an app for birth control, if that's what you're looking for, then make sure to look for one that has specific scientific backing, and contact the company and see if you can get that research in your hot little hands. If they're boasting that they have scientific evidence, then you should be able to see it. Number 5, your fertile signs always come first. So whatever signs you see in your body come before the app. The app always comes second to what you see in your body. Always trust your body over whatever the app is telling you. Number 6, maintain a healthy skepticism of apps and devices that advertise themselves as birth control. Because again, the method itself, in my opinion, is the birth control, not the app. So if the app is saying that it's birth control, maintain a healthy skepticism and make sure to do your homework. Make sure to find out as much as you can about the company, about the device, and see how much information the company is willing to disclose about how the device is programmed and the algorithms, as well as the scientific research to back it. So tips for choosing an app, quick recap. Choose an app that allows you to turn off the predictor settings. Choose an app that allows you to record all of the data points. So the main 3 fertility awareness data points, as well as any other information that you think is important. Look for apps that do not change and manipulate your entry. So apps that are solely for data entry. And number 4, consider that many free apps may actually sell your personal information. Without identifiers, but they're likely selling information to third-party data miners and companies. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. So I'm really curious to see what you have to say. Maybe you completely disagree with me. Maybe you agree with certain points. Maybe it was just something that you haven't thought about a whole lot. But whatever the case, I want to invite you to join us in the Fertility Friday Facebook community. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/community, and we'll be having an interesting discussion in there. Like I mentioned, if you're trying to figure out which app is the best, I think the best, we'll have a conversation in there. I'll ask for, the members of the group to share what is their favorite app and why, and what features they appreciate the most. So again, this isn't an anti-app show necessarily. It's more just of airing certain concerns and issues that I see with charting apps, and certain issues that I see especially with apps that are predicting the fertile window. And the reason for me to share this information with you is because ultimately I want you to be successful using fertility awareness. I want the method to work for you. If you are trying to conceive, I want you to be able to optimize your cycle to achieve pregnancy. And I've seen that sometimes this kind of thought process and the prediction and the concept of kind of like a regular cycle pattern can actually make it harder. And it can prompt you to ignore your body signs over what you think should be happening. And that's a problem. And same thing with birth control. If you're wanting to use this method to avoid pregnancy naturally, I think it's really, really important for you to set yourself up for success. And ultimately, if you're going to use a method, I think it's really important for you to learn that method and not solely 100% rely on an app to, advise you when you're in your fertile window or not. Because I want you to succeed. I want you to, if this is what you're looking for, a hormone-free method of birth control that's really effective, I want it to be really effective for you. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's show. You'll find the show notes episodes over at fertilityfriday.com/204. I want to send a special shout out to the show sponsor, Steamy Chick. So make sure to head over to steamychick.com and take a look at the Steamy Chick Vaginal Steam Facilitator certification. So again, that's steamychick.com. And I want to invite you to join us in the July Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to get started. And, this program is a great opportunity to learn fertility awareness, to gain confidence in charting, to really get clear on your cervical mucus observations. I think that's the number one challenge that the majority of my clients are faced with, really trying to understand and interpret their cervical mucus so that they can know exactly which days in their cycle are fertile and which days are not, so that you can use the method successfully and effectively. If you are looking to discover fertility awareness and to use it in your own life, I want you to benefit from the 99.4% efficacy. And it all starts by having a really clear and specific understanding about your cervical mucus patterns. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information and to apply. I'm only doing one group over the summer. I usually run 2 at a time, so I usually have more spots available. But this time, since I'm only running one group, I do have a limited number of spaces available. So if you're wanting to join us, make sure to head over and apply. So again, fertilityfriday.com/group program. And so I just want to thank you for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate you for taking the time to listen to the show, for all of you for supporting the show, for sharing the show with your friends. That is how the show has grown all these years, it's really been word of mouth, one woman at a time, just sharing the show with her friends. And I really appreciate all of you for being part of this community. And so, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.